Okay, let's get started with our presentation. It's going to be presented by Ron Lewis here.
That's me.
And so I'm going to turn this over to Ron. So here you go, Ron.
Because I know there's some veterans among us. That's true in heartfelt right there. We've had some new members in the past 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years. How many of you have actually met Mr. Crabtree? I got one in me. Carolyn, had you met him?
Did not get a chance.
Well, just a very, very brief, because we're going to give you a lot more information on him. Mr. Crabtree was born in Portland, Oregon. And he ended up here with a collection of ships that's called the Crabtree Collection. He made all of them. He died in 1994, and prior to that, he had lived in Florida. He and his wife moved to Florida. They came back here, and he was here in Newport News when he died in 94. And you'll hear some more about him as we go along. But just wondering. I was pleased and honored to be chosen to play a small part in the rebirth in 2006 of the gallery often referred to as the Gem of the Mariners Museum. Our team spent literally months going through reams of paper, creating historically accurate and hopefully interesting label copy when the gallery was redesigned, completely renewed for the first time since its grand opening in 1956, 50 years earlier. I was introduced to August Crabtree about 60 years ago. He was a ship modeler in his mid-50s, been with the museum for just a few years then. And he was showing off the remarkable miniature ships he had brought to the museum in 1955. And this is how he brought them. Yep. Wow. That's a Chevy step van that he had built 16 cradles inside to hold his vessels. Now, he had built a museum in Florida in 1952 and staffed it with his wife and himself. I'm not sure I would stop at a museum like that if I were just traveling through Florida. Well, nobody else really wanted to either. He had no marketing department, no CFO, no maintenance crew, no gift shop. It was just his wife and himself. The museum, however, was a much bigger headache than he expected. So he reluctantly packed up his ships and went roving around the countryside, the eastern part, with his truck to show off his work wherever he could. And whenever somebody would give him a couple bucks. Well, he landed at the Mariners Museum main entrance and showed the staff his treasures. Staff and conservators talked him into abandoning this sort of torture to his work. Bring him inside. He was not a living legend then, just another, albeit extraordinary, ship modeler who, unlike those few I was familiar with at the time, he was still alive. But I was fascinated with the ships he built. Of course, I wanted to know more about him, so I just listened. He said he was impatient. Didn't sound quite right, but the intense desire to see your work completed does prompt a certain impatience. He said he grew to dislike the work of his project. Well, that didn't make a whole lot of sense either. Okay, he was young, just 20 or so, when he started the work in 1925. He just wanted to get it over with so he could get on to other things. When he started, he said he thought it would take, a year or so to build, quote, a fleet of miniature ships. Many modelers would spend a year completing just one accurate model. He came to call his opus a project, and he said that with a bit of a snarl. But I didn't learn much more about the modeler, so I began to study the ships. I like to think Mr. Crabtree lost himself often in the history of these ships, as I did when I was researching them. The melody of the great naval battle of Lepanto, the last great battle of galleys in 1571, amid the clash and ramming and splintering war galleys, the men of Columbus's crew at sea on uncharted waters, trying to deal with their constant fears and doubts, and often on the verge of mutiny. The cannonballs whirring overhead, splashing down around the 50-gun English man-of-war, battling the French, the Spanish, Portuguese, the Dutch. British Navy was ready to pick a fight with almost anyone. The study of these ships at their time is intoxicating, enthralling, captivating. And there was with August Crabtree a constant and time-consuming effort of research, study, so that his can be the very finest miniature ships of their time. Well, you have to bear in mind that the things that come so easily to us today, thanks to the internet and highly advanced research methods, had to be diligently and painstakingly sought out. In Crabtree's day, he corresponded in the old fashion with naval architects, archaeologists, curators, historians in England, in Egypt, in Venice. Then, when enough information was gathered, the laborious process of finding and curing and working with the wood could begin. Then, acquiring or making the very specialized tools. Then creating each of the parts and assembling the vessel, just as it was done in the dockyards where the original was built. Assembly, therefore, must have felt like a holiday after all the preliminaries. And this was a pioneering effort. Many of our modern tools and techniques didn't exist or hadn't been discovered, but the result of his perseverance is this remarkable gallery of 16 1/48 scale vessels. In other words, quarter inch represents a foot. In real dimension, actually, 3 out of them are 1/32 scale, that exemplify the major steps in the evolution of the sailing ship. And that's the gallery we're going to explore in a moment. But first, I'd like to tell you a little bit about the evolution of the artist himself. August Fletcher Crabtree, named August for his birth month. Fletcher, his father's first name, was born in August 1905, the 29th, in Portland, Oregon. His father was a railroad man, but his great-grandfather built ships here on the River Clyde in Scotland. As a young boy, August, who was often called Gus by his friends and people who wrote about him, was captivated by history and read and studied often in libraries whenever he had the opportunity. His most valued possession as a boy was his penknife. He loved to carve and whittle. His mother said he'd rather whittle than work, and that disturbed her. He also enjoyed watching with his father Fletcher the ships that plied the nearby Columbia River, the cargoes, passengers. He did work in shipyards during 2 short periods of his life. The GM Standifer Shipyard in Vancouver, Washington, at the end of World War I, and Kaiser Shipyard in Portland through World War II. Therefore, he had some proper training in observation of the structure of wooden ships of the 20th century. August moved to California for a while and worked with motion picture studios, primarily MGM, offering nautical counsel, building models for staged and promotional efforts for movies such as Mutiny on the Bounty, That Hamilton Woman, Captains Courageous. In 1942, August met and married Winifred Clark. Winnie had moved from Minnesota to California to stay with an elderly widow for whom she was chauffeur and caretaker. She took an interest in his work. He invited her after Sunday school, "Come on up and see me," which she did. But she took an interest in his work, which was really nearing completion then. Most had already been done by 1939. But she wanted to help, so she took on the onerous task to Crabtree, because it's something he did not want to do, of sail making and painting. He was naturally skilled at both. Winifred died on August 16th, 2005, 2 weeks before what would have been August's 100th birthday. Back to the process of building the ships. Well, August began work on this collection around 1925. He studied wood and its properties, harvested the woods that he felt most closely matched the oaks and pines used in the original vessels, but to a scale of 1/48. There's an interesting situation here with scale. Some of the docents in the museum have said he'd used the original woods. Think of a piece of oak, and I think of church pews. In front of me, I can see these big black stripes in it. Take that piece of oak down to 1/48, the size of a plank. What have you done? You've magnified the grain 48 times. So the task is to find a piece of wood that looks like 1/48 size grain. The same thing is true with many of the other things that Crabtree did, but he was careful about it. His first ship, there, was the Mayflower, and it was from a drawing he'd seen in a book. On completion, he didn't like it. Further study revealed more about the original ship. He saw clearly his model was neither accurate nor pleasing to the eye. This incidentally is not his model. He gave it away without disclosing the identity of the then unknown creator. His second effort, after studying artists' portrayals of ships, principally the Van de Vels, the Dutch artists, was the Dutch Admiralty yacht. So this one is the oldest model in the collection. The wings that you see and port and starboard are called lee boards, and they can be raised or lowered to aid the progress and navigation of such a ship operating in the often very shallow waters of the Netherlands. What many don't know is that in the mid-70s, he built a second Dutch yacht, as he felt at the time that after 50 years of experience, he could do better. That ship was given on Crabtree's death in 1994 to Portland, his hometown, and home of the Oregon Maritime Center. As the center has closed its doors, the ship, as well as a Swedish ship, which was still in frame when he died, is either being kept in a bank vault today or is under possession of Dean Runyon. I corresponded with several people that Crabtree knew. Dean Runyon was an architect who was the director of the board of the Oregon Maritime Center when they closed and helped solve some of the problems. We think Crabtree's second Dutch yacht might be in a box under Mr. Runyon's desk. Tried to get it here, but they weren't willing to lend, and they had established a value on his ship of $250,000. So we also didn't want to advertise a ship with a for sale tag on it. So that kind of failed. They still have both of those. Anyway, here's what the museum looked like in 1957. It's clearly a temporary setup. It takes some time to build a permanent gallery in a museum, and the one we visit now is an updated and far more accessible version of the original than Mr. Crabtree and created by his general specifications. His ship would be, in his words, floating in the air in a jewel-like setting. This is the new gallery. Well, new since 2006. And here's the 57 gallery. Note where the red circles are. There were magnifiers in several of the vitrines to help you see the wonderful artwork. And what's this? Does anybody recognize that small part? It is our gondola, which shared the gallery with Mr. Crabtree for a while because they needed to put his ship somewhere. So they moved a couple things over and set up some sawhorses almost. After we had decided, we're going to keep them, the museum contracted with Mr. Crabtree for 20 years, during which years he will be paid as a professional interpreter, a wood carver, and a demonstrator, and we will be buying his entire collection at his price points through that 20-year period. We can talk about what happened after that. It ain't pretty, so I won't discuss it here, but anyone who wants and is interested, just let me know. He became pretty well known over the years locally, and here he is featured guest on a morning television show. And internationally, here's a group of Soviet scientists visiting the gallery in 1974. That's Mr. Crabtree, second from the left. He also, as a local celebrity, donated 2 or 3 times, I believe, unique carvings to the Peninsula Nature and Science Center. We know it today as the Virginia Living Museum. He auctioned or had things auctioned as fundraisers for various institutions. His items always brought in quite a bit of money. Well, ship models are exhibited in pretty much every gallery of the museum. They vary in size as they vary in scale and purpose. The variance lies largely in the fact that they range in time from 1500 BCE to the 21st century, a span of over 3,500 years. Here's one of the smallest, the miniature of the sort of funeral barge that would have borne Admiral Lord Nelson, and it was built by a well-known modeler. His name is Donald McNary, and he's written a number of good books on ship modeling techniques. He delighted in the challenge of ultra-small scale. This one is a 24th of an inch to a foot, or 1/288 scale. Mr. McNary, as most of us know, died in 2010. Here's the largest of the models in the Mariners Museum, the Queen Elizabeth. It was built by the owners of the Cunard Line in 1939. It was part of a remarkable exhibit of some of the Cunard fleet at the World's Fair in New York. The scale is 3/9 of an inch to a foot, so the model, actually a half model, is over 30 feet long. The Queen is still on the wall of our largest gallery. Has anyone seen it?
Yes. Oh, yes.
Has anyone seen it recently?
Nope, not really.
Why?
Behind a wall. Covered it up.
Right. Once we established the America's Cup Gallery, we walled off the Queen because we couldn't figure out how to get her off the wall to begin with. So she's still there. Here's the Queen Elizabeth in 1939, obviously in New York Harbor. And here's a 19th century sailing ship. Incidentally, if you saw the Queen Elizabeth from the Crabtree Gallery, you could have been standing right beside what he called the Lexington, the armed brig. You look at the Lexington and look out at the 30-foot Queen Elizabeth. The Queen Elizabeth is actually in smaller scales than the Lexington. That's what I want to show you now. Here's a silhouette of a 19th century ship. Here's the Queen again. Now I'm going to place a silhouette of the sailing ship in the water with the Queen so they'll be on the same scale. Here's what it would have looked like. Both sides in the water. So over a 100-year time span, going from wooden to iron and steel construction, ships became a bit larger than ever imagined in the days of famous East India Company. So the question might be, why build model ships? Well, here's the Mariner's Great Hall of Steam as it was a few years ago. It was the first permanent gallery when the museum opened in 1933. These models are the largest in the collection. Most of them were built from detailed plans by shipyard model shops before the ships were built. Once the model was completed, the shipwrights could measure, determine the arcs and curves and lifts and stations, and lay out the parts of the ship at full size in very large rooms called mold loss. Exactly.
What are they called again? Mold loft.
Mold loft.
Mold loft.
These are, it's like a big gymnasium with no block. They have their pieces from the model, which is 1/48 scale, and they simply blow them up and make the patterns for the ship from the models. Why? This started back in the 16th century. The shipwrights were great at their jobs, whether it was caulking or bending planks or whatever, but they couldn't read architects' plans. So generally, the architect himself made a ship model at 1/48 scale, presented to the Navy Board or whoever he wants to sell it to, and they say, "Can you make it bigger?" And he said, "Yeah." So they said, "Okay, we'll guarantee a sale." That's where mold loft started. Not used so much today because of computer technology, but they are still used in some shipyards. So there are a number of reasons to build models, but as we're interested today in one man's life work and the models he created, we'll look at his reason. or spending half of his life up until 1949, when he completed the project, building 16 miniature vessels and ships, one at a time. Take a close look at the vessels he built and their history. Mr. Crabtree had, since his youth, a penchant and a talent for sculpting in wood. He had entered, in fact, the local craft contest in his early years, and his submission was a bas-relief carving of a ship. He didn't win any prizes. The judges would not admit his work for judging. Why? Young August could not possibly have built this by himself. So the judges would not look at it. Well, he was disappointed, but not for long. That cemented his decision to continue this pursuit. And later, while visiting in Seattle, he saw a small display of miniature ships in a bank shop's window, and coincidentally noticed a marquee of a show called The Evolution of Popular Music. That was good enough for him. The project that would occupy most of his adult life would be carvings and models of our maritime experience. And it would be a scale depiction of the evolution of water transport. The first completed, as I said earlier, was this Dutch yacht. And we'll look at it more closely when we get up to the 17th century. He didn't intend to build in chronological order. The yacht, however, was the first type that he could gather complete and accurate information about. Chronologically, we'll begin in prehistoric times and move quickly to the 15th century BCE. The raft and dugout canoe were the easiest and simplest, of course. I understand that his original raft disappeared as he brought the pieces to the museum. Probably went into somebody's pocket, but this is a substitute. It was built by him at the museum. This form of water transport was a natural. Early man knew that wood floats, stone don't. Grab a tree trunk or a limb if you wish to travel in water, not a stone. We'll start the real story in Egypt, and I can't imagine a more recognizable icon than this guy, the Sphinx. What do you think? All obelisks. We have Hatshepsut to thank for these ceremonial towers and memorials. Many of the sculptures honored her or her brother and husband, Tutmos II. The stones for the obelisk were quarried in Aswan and had to be transferred up to Karnak, or Thebes, or Luxor, the same place, just different names, different periods. A river voyage of about 110, 115 miles. The stones weighed from 350 to 400 tons apiece. How do we accomplish that transport? This is her temple, the Deir Bahari, near Luxor. Deeply engraved on the walls of Deir Bahari are pictures of the ships that Hatshepsut employed to move these stones up the Nile. Here's a clearer drawing or interpretation of the carving showing two obelisk stones, a total weight of over 700 tons. And Dr. Crabtree's rendition in miniature. The vessel is very simple. It's essentially a raft with sides, no keel, built of short, very thick lengths of sycamore and acacia wood, sometimes cedar. This hog truss provides the only lateral stability. Steering oars astern, the forerunner of the rudder, and the ever-present lotus blossom at the stern. The curled stern being a holdover from the reed boats common on the Nile. They identify this vessel as very common to the 18th dynasty, the 15th century BCE. The lotus, with its 5 petals representing the human extremities, was a sacred symbol and gave life to the vessel. Now, to evolve the primitive vessel to one more generally useful, especially the waters of the Mediterranean, a backbone for the hull must be introduced, a keel. This bas-relief is in Pompeii, which, as you know, was inundated by Mount Vesuvius in 79 CE. It seems to show a Roman corbitum, or punto, a grain ship, extensively used in the centuries around the imperial period. This coin is from the same time and features a ship typical of the era. Grain ships would hold from 70 to over 300 tons of grain and were built on a keel but they weren't useful as warships. But Rome didn't really need warships at the time. However, around the 3rd century BCE, the Phoenicians established themselves in Carthage and operated a great trade empire from this base with well-designed and the best-built ships of their time. Rome clearly saw this as a threat. Well, you can see Carthage sticking out in the Mediterranean Sea. They had a lot of control there, and Rome didn't like it. Well, 100-ship navy that copied the Phoenicians was quickly developed by Rome and started the Punic Wars. Remember this guy? Hannibal was a central figure in the wars, and all battles were land battles. Sea battles were land battles fought on the decks of ships. Rome now had a navy to challenge Carthaginian trade right out in the Mediterranean. And now, Mr. Crabtree's replica at 1/48 scale of a 1st century Roman ponto. Its hull is built with planking laid edge to edge. There was no name for it then. There is now. We'll get to it. A building style that has particular use then. Also, the swan appearance at the stern was common, as well as the ornate steering oars on both sides of the ship. And it's blue. Pirate ship? Well, ships were black at the time. They were coated with pitch and tar. Only the pirates painted theirs blue to be invisible against the sea and sky. My option. Mr. Crabtree didn't say that. How about sails? Well, the single sail, mainsail, well, there's your swan. The single mainsail was as the Egyptians, but also a foresail called the artemon to help direct the ship. Steering oars are fine, but the artemon helped turn the ship and get it in proper direction more easily. Figure here at the stern is St. Paul on the poop deck, where the Bible in the book of Acts says he was a shipwreck on Malta. Around 60 CE, the time of this ship, Crabtree admitted that Paul was a bit chubbier than intended, planned to remove him, cut down his girth a bit, and install. He didn't get the chance to do that. Now, August Crabtree didn't take his historical eras one at a time. We've just jumped from 15th century BCE to 50 CE, and now to the 11th century CE, specifically the year 1066. Scholars can identify with that, but by the way, this will slow down when we arrive at the 17th century. But for now, here's an embroidery work that we should all recognize, a bio tapestry, a cruel embroidery work probably created by nuns in the 11th century, depicts the battle which caused the rise of William, the King of England, the Conqueror. William the Conqueror. We know the history of William's takeover of England, his brief war with Harold Godwinson, whom he defeated at Hastings, and his rise to prominence as one of the most influential and enlightened rulers of the Western world. What we don't know is what his fleet of ships looked like in 1066. The tapestry is akin to a cartoon, having little in detail. Well, we have a pretty good example here. This is an excavation. It was opened in 1904 and revealed a Viking ship buried in a funeral mound in the 9th century CE. The ship is called the Oseberg ship because it was unearthed in Oseberg. Oseberg, Asa, Queen. There was a woman buried in the ship. Now resides in a museum in Oslo, Norway. It was incredibly well preserved. It's typical of the ships of the time, and since William was essentially a Viking, it's a good example of the ships depicted on the tapestry. So Mr. Crabtree studied current history of this ship and the tapestry and produced what is probably one of the most accurate depictions of William, the Duke of Normandy's flagship. That's the flag of the Duke of Normandy, and that's his son, Robert, who was mentioned being on the bow of the ship, and here he's at the stern. Well, when he invaded, this ship led the invasion with 250 to 700 additional ships in his fleet. I don't know what the figures are, and they really go up to 1,000. We're comfortable with about 250 to 500. The structure, unlike the Roman ship, is of planks overlapped like shingles on the house. It has a name. It's called lat straight construction, also clincher or clinker. By the way, if you've ever wondered what the term starboard originated, here's the steerboard, starboard side of the ship, where the steering oar was attached in Viking ships. Details are absent in the tapestry, but abundant in the real ships of the time, so we can easily visualize the invasion and its grisly conclusion with the understanding that, again, it was the ship that made all the difference. Here's someone you should recognize. His name, well, I can give you three, but we'll stick with Christopher Columbus. He was born in Genoa in 1451, became a noted navigator and adventurer. He spent a large part of his life developing a plan to sail to Chipango, that's Japan or the East Indies, lying well to the east to open a shorter route to trade goods by sailing west about 2,500 miles or so. He thought. In 1492, ripe old age of 41, he left Palos with 3 borrowed ships. He went through the course of his life through this 4 times, discovering for Spain a land that hadn't existed in the minds of the Western world. But his first voyage was the one we remember. These 3 ships took him with 90 sailors to a new world. We surely had the results of evolution here: a stern-hung rudder, much more improved suit of sails, multiple decks. Most 19th century sailors would have felt pretty much at home in this 15th century ship. We're looking at the Santa Maria, also called La Galea, because she was built in Galicia, Spain, northwest corner, and the Pinta, called Pinta because she was brightly painted. Although the real name, the Santa Clara, which was called Nina, as she was owned by a fellow named Juan Nino, was very much like the Pinta, so he didn't need to build that one. They were both called caravels, historic ships. Yeah, they were. But of all these 16 miniatures, these are the ones of which we know the least. Maritime and historical puzzle. The Santa Maria only made half of one of Columbus's trips. The first one she got here was run aground, couldn't get her off the shoal, and the ship was taken apart. And a fort was built to store 40 men. Remember, he came over with 90, 40 on the Santa Maria, 24 on the Pinta, and 26 on the Nina. They came back in 1493. The fort was burned. The men were gone. Cannibals ruled the area. And you can decide for yourself. Okay, this is not a ship. It's a somewhat regal complex. How does it figure into our maritime theme? Take a closer look. There are some masts there. It is the Casa d'Arsenal in Venice, the royal shipyard. Not just the largest shipyard, but the largest industrial complex in Europe. And it was the location responsible for the huge war galleys of the 17th century. Notice that lateen sail, difficult to handle due to its size. Venice had a most efficient operation in the 16th century. Her shipyard employed as many as 16,000 workers and had established craft guilds with specialized crews of workers so that those who did the best jobs in specific tasks applied their trades as others worked in their own areas. With this specialist setup, the Arsenal was able to impress the King of France upon a visit by him by building a galley start to finish in 24 hours. Compare this feat to Mr. Crabtree's estimated time to build this very ornate galleass, displaying about 360 carved figures in nearly 48 months. How did the Arsenal build a galley in 24 hours? They had laid up parts. It was like an assembly line. Now, for something completely different. It's interesting that Crabtree has reproduced ships that had had a significant history. Was this his intent? Remember, in the early to mid 20th century, it was difficult to find details on vessels that did not have historical significance. But while Mr. Crabtree was researching another vessel, came upon this interesting reference. At one time in the late 16th century, about 15,000 of these gondolas worked in the canals of Venice. Today, about 400 or so. Here's one we saw earlier in the presentation. It's here in the museum and enjoyed a moment of international fame back in 2011 when it was loaned to the National Gallery as a prop for their Canaletto exhibit. One time it left the museum for a while. And this is Doge Francesco Morosini, who governed Venice in the late 17th century. He was rather flamboyant, and even though he had complete freedom to use the royal barge Bucentaur, he also had made for himself a very ornate personal gondola. This is the one August Crabtree happened upon while researching the Arsenal. It sports about 60 carvings and weighs 1/2 of 1 ounce, about 14 paper clips. By the way, Mrs. Crabtree posed for this one. August was having trouble carving the underside of the maiden's upper arm, so she provided hers as a guide. As she told me that story, she made me promise never to tell anyone, so I don't. Now, the study of anything French will invariably involve the monarchy, especially in the 17th century. I'm not going into the details of all of the Cromwell, the Revolution, etc., except to say that Charles II was exiled in the Netherlands. Rather enjoyed large parts of that exile, especially the working yachts. Working yachts. Charles was not a blue-collar guy. He was a playboy. In the off-season, however, the owners raced their yachts, and there was hefty monetary reward for the winners. Well, this was right up Charles' alley. Here's the Royal Dutch Staaten yacht, the very first built of the collection. Note the sail configuration. We have the huge sail area of the great Venetian galleys, but divided into 3 workable parts. It becomes a much more adaptable sail plan. The square topsail makes this a Staaten yacht. Take off the topsail, and it's a Biesen yacht. Either way, it's very ornate and would have served as a messenger for government purposes, and royal vaisseaux as a yard would be primarily for state use, not be a working ship. Charles, admiring these elegant, very agile ships, was awarded one upon the termination of his exile and restoration to the throne. The yacht was named Mary and served as the first of Charles' fleet of yachts, numbered about 25 at the time. Here's one of that fleet, the Royal Yacht Catherine, named for Charles's wife, Catherine of Braganza, who incidentally brought tea to England and port wine. As we review these masterpieces, remember that they have all been structured from the keel up, frames, planking, just as their full-size originals were in the Royal Dockyards. A most important category in the evolving design and employment of these, the largest moving structures in our history, warships. This is, of course, that other National Maritime Museum, the one across the pond. And this is where Mr. Crabtree found his favorite ship, a 50-gun battleship, a ship of the line at the time, named St. Albans. Why St. Albans? Well, remember, Charlie named the gifted yacht Mary after his mother. He was a good son. He named his royal yacht Catherine. She's his wife. He was a good husband. But Charles and his brother James had a history of naming some of the Royal Navy ships after mistresses or their offspring. And one of them, by Charles, this beautiful actress, Nell Gwynn, was Charles Beauclerk, first Duke of St. Albans. A thinly veiled reference then to the love child of Charles. The British Museum owns the original builder's model, built in 1687, probably by the ship's architect, Fisher Harding. Mr. Crabtree copied that ship as his first warship model. Look closely at the carvings. There are about 270 of them, and they are impeccably recreated here in whitethorn, a very dense and slow-growing wood. The building of such a warship was very expensive, but 25% of the cost would have been devoted to this elaborate ornamentation. Got a little ahead of myself on this slide. Now comes a fellow named Louis. Not this Louis. This Louis. This is Louis the 14th with a bunch of wealthy friends, mostly dukes. He's probably preparing to take them on his private royal galley, the Madam. The Madam. That's Charles. The galleys were the predominant penal institution in the 17th century, and the oarsmen, which were 5 per oar typically, were shackled to a chain running fore and aft. The drummer kept up a steady rhythm to make the sweeps more efficient, and this fellow made sure they stayed awake. The drumhead, incidentally, would have been a sheepskin or a deer hide. To scale, that's not possible. Sheep and deer have follicles. They have fur, they have hair coming out of it. Make that follicle 48 times bigger, and you've got the same problem you have with the oak. Mr. Crabtree caught a field mouse, had a little red book on skinning and tanning leather, and he skinned the mouse and tanned it himself to make the drumhead.
Wow.
By the way, most model builders would probably carve a ship's boat from a solid piece if it's this small, but Mr. Crabtree built this one of over 200 pieces of wood. 200 pieces of wood to put together. You haven't even started the ship yet. The Louvre, incidentally, has a 10-foot model of the Madam. Now, the only American ship in the fleet is not a ship. Here's why. A ship, by this time, early 1800s, has 3 or more masts and set sail square rig. This is not a ship. It's a brig. In fact, a snow brig, because of the snow sail, the stern. In the later years of the 18th century, the U.S. had acquired a merchant brigantine named Wild Duck and converted her to a small 16-ton brig named Lexington. Some have named this Crabtree's mistake. Mr. Crabtree had based his brig on drawings from a 1930 plan, therefore gave it the name Lexington because the plan preferred that. On further examination, however, certain features of the vessel were anachronistic for the late 18th century, particularly the ship's boats were stowed on crane-type structures called davits. These curved davits in this position would have appeared several years after the demise of Lexington. In addition, these rods, called jackstays, were not used until about 1810. Lexington was long gone. The sails, by the way, would have been bent to the jackstays. You notice Mr. Crabtree's brig up close. The jackstays are there, but the sails are still bent to the yards. Anyway, that was their purpose. But Mr. Crabtree's miniature was not a mistake. The plans he followed were flawed. And we're going to close out with the 2 biggest ships in the fleet. Excuse me. The British East India Company was chartered in 1600 by the Queen. And was the most powerful and longest lived monopoly in our history. In fact, the John Company, as it was known, controlled half of the world's trade, So obviously, other trading nations were regularly in conflict with England's monopoly. And the East Indiamen were armed and well trained to take care of themselves and their precious cargoes. Building a ship this large, over 170 feet long, required about 400 acres of old oak forest. Oaks that would have taken 80 to 100 years to reproduce. Good English oak was becoming a scarce commodity, and the Royal Fellsmen regularly patrolled the forests, marking the critical trees with the royal arrow. These great oaks would be the exclusive property of the crown. So this ship, an East Indiaman and not His Majesty's Royal Navy, would be among the first to substitute lesser woods, pine, elm, and therefore replace much of the framework and bracing with iron they needed to stream. Crabtree's East Indiaman dates to the early 19th century, the last days of the company. Two details are missed by even the most careful observer, but with proper guidance, you can see here under the quarterdeck, and I cannot show you, it's impossible, except in person, a double steering wheel. And here, through a gun port, the complete steering gear that makes the rudder respond to the wheel. Unbelievably authentic detail for something you can't even see on the ship. Well, Baker's only marginally sane. Now you have to see this in person. And while the stern is very neat and shapely, you'll not see the prolific ornamental carvings that were commonplace in the century before. The ship has no planking on its port side. I'd like to think that she's been docked to strip off her planking, replank her, and send her back to sea. Why would that be necessary? Well, while she's laid up in dry dock, she can't be productive. Workers are paid to strip her planking. Now planking needs purchasing, and then replanking her requires paid shipwrights. She's idle for months and costing the company a pretty penny. The East Indiamen on a trade mission might stay at sea for 12, 18 months on one cruise. There's a danger here to the structure of the ship itself. Called Teredo nivalis, commonly called shipworm. Sort of a seagoing termite, the shipworm bored into the ship's planking and tunneled along the grain lines, destroying the planking within 4 to 6 months. But the replanking saved the ship, even though it was terribly expensive. Many remedies were tried, only one succeeded in defeating these invaders. Here's the last of Mr. Crabtree's fleet. Bark-rigged ship named, as were many before and since, Britannia. About the middle of the 18th century, the French experimented with a process called coppering. The entire hull of a ship below the waterline was clad with sheets of copper, 14 inches by 4 feet. The cladding was nailed to the planking in an overlapping fashion and was totally successful in keeping out the shipworm and discouraging marine growth such as barnacles, also increasing the ship's speed because it has a clean bottom. This was Sam Kennard's first steam-powered ocean liner, and she crossed the Atlantic on her first cruise the blink of an eye. Well, relatively speaking, 14 days and 8 hours. A new world record. The ship, built in 1840, exemplifies a huge transition in propulsion and design. The steam engine, producing about 740 horsepower at this age, being paired with a full suit of sails. The sail plan, the copper bottom, moved the ship through the water at about 14 knots. When the wind died and other ships were making no progress or even drifting with the current in the wrong direction, Britannia was making the incredible speed with her steam plant and paddle wheels of about 8 knots, burning through nearly 40 tons of coal every 24 hours. The paddle wheels on her sides were not the most efficient use of steam power, but the reliability of regular ocean crossing earned Mr. Kennard an RMS designation, Royal Mail Ship, and a pretty good income. The Kennard line has become one of the two most famous rivals for transatlantic excursion Snard and White Star merged in 1934. Now both have been folded into Carnival Cruise Lines. And here ended the lesson. I think John Masefield said it best. The romance of the sea, often a burden of worries to those men who work the ships, is now replaced by more efficient and more reliable steam power, heated by nuclear furnaces. And according to Dr. Crabtree, his quote, what we have after the advent of steam is an iron monster belching great clouds of black smoke into the sky. There's nothing romantic about them. These ships are no more, but their impact on our maritime heritage is forever. So August Fletcher Crabtree's legacy and his contribution to a history that spans over 3,000 years will remind us for generations to come that we, all of us, are mariners.
Good presentation.
Thank you.
Yes. Go back to a question. His next number, that's pretty good.
Okay, if you have questions, I'd be happy to answer my.
Well done.
That is extremely well done. Thank you.
Does Mr. Crabtree support himself while he was building models?
He said, in his words, we didn't thrive, we barely survived. Winifred, up to 1942, when he married Winifred, Winifred had jobs everywhere they went. In fact, when he left Florida and closed the museum, she went to work for the Chamber of Commerce in Florida. She had ways of producing income. When he worked for the studios, particularly MGM and a little bit with Columbia, they paid him very well for his work. When he got here in 55 and made the deal with the museum in 56, he was paid standard fare. But remember the 20 years between 56 and 76, his 20-year contract, inflation ran amok. And at the end of 1956, Mrs. Crabtree was still working. Mr. Crabtree was being paid by the museum. Mrs. Crabtree went berserk. And she said the figures were nothing. The museum stole those ships from August. He always had some money coming in, but it was never a whole lot. He worked as he was a prize fighter, in fact. And he was called an elongated torpedo, I think, or something like that. He won many of his fights. He went to work for a meatpacking plant, and he said, and this became a famous phrase later, or whether he borrowed it, I don't know. If you like sausage, never go into a meatpacking plant. He lied about his age when he went to work for the shipyards. He was like 14 at the time. The close of World War I, he lied about his age, and they gave him a job in the boat loft at the first one. And then he was called back to the St. John's job, the Kaiser Yard in World War II, to redevelop the sealing of the doors on landing craft. There was a problem with it. So he eked out a living. Sure.
Two questions. One, what part of Florida was that? You know?
It was on Highway 1, and it was between, no, I don't. It starts with a V, and I can't.
Vero Beach?
Vero Beach. Volusia?
No. Got a whole stack of information in a briefcase. I can look that up. He actually built, with help of a couple of guys there, he built that museum from cinder blocks mostly.
Yeah.
And it's gone now.
The other question, did he have any hint at might have any children?
No, they had no children. When they were asked about that, which was inevitable, for pretty much every time I was, they'd say, these are our children, these 16 vessels. Mrs. Crabtree, at the end of his 20-year contract in 76, was, does anybody here know John Tilley? I think you do, John. John Tilley was a curator here during Mr. Crabtree's stay for some time. Died several years ago, I think.
3 years ago. Yeah.
We had a lot. We had a lot of correspondence, needless to say, until he let me know exactly what he thought. Mr. Crabtree was a hard person to know. And here's a word that might have some value. Sorry to say a word of advice, but I'm not advising you, I'm just giving you my experience. A fellow named Dave Engan was a naval officer, a lieutenant in the Navy, and he met Mr. Crabtree here in the museum. He was stationed in Norfolk. I mentioned his name to someone who knew him. He said, no, he wasn't a Navy captain, he was a merchant Marine. Yeah, he served in the Navy as a lieutenant. When he finished his tour of duty in the Navy, he joined the Merchant Marine. And Dave Engan was a captain in the Merchant Marine. He was pretty well known. He was a well-known ship modeler at the time. And I had been conversing with him by mail. And I thought, as I'm back into the Crabtree thing, I want to converse with him again. Died last year. Forgive me. The lesson is, do it now. I should have continued a communication with Dave Beaton and had a lot of respect for him. I did not, and now I can't. That's the lesson. Do it. Anyway, Dave and his fellow named Elmer Knight lived in Oswego, who made bows. I still don't know whether he made violin bows or bow and arrow bows, but he helped Mr. Crabtree with a lot of his wood identification and use of wood. And he had died some time ago. I got a note from his son, Ron, and it had pictures of two ships. Were these early Crabtree ships? How should I know? I've got pictures of those. So converse with people you want to converse with and keep conversing with them. Life is short. Any other questions or comments or anything? Oh, thank you. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Hey, John.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Go to the shop. Yeah. Yeah, it's a plant that comes with us. I don't know if y'all want to use it or not.
Okay, this puts the end to today's meeting. I appreciate everybody being with us. I hope you all have a good day. And really excellent presentation. And again, thanks for joining us. And I look forward to seeing you all next month.
Thank you. Happy Thanksgiving to all.
That's true. Thanksgiving's coming up. Enjoy your turkey.
I'll bring one. I'll bring one.